Picture the most isolated place you've ever been. A village so small you can walk from one end to the other in under 3 minutes. 14 houses, a track of churned mud between them, a mill at one end and a church at the other. Now imagine that village is your entire world, not your home base, not the place you grew up in before you left. Your entire world, the full extent of it. The road out doesn't exist for you. The market town you can see on clear days from the ridge above your house. 8 miles away, maybe less. Might as well be on the moon. You were born here. You will die here. Your children will be born here. They will die here. And if you try to leave, if you pack your bundle and walk down that road toward that distant smudge of church towers and market crosses, the Lord's men will come after you. They'll bring you back. And what happens when they bring you back will teach every other man, woman and child in this village exactly what happens to people who think they can just go. That's not a story, that's a system. Add to that 300 acres of strip-farmed common field that theoretically feed 240 people, minus the 10th that goes to the church, minus the toll at the Lord's mill, minus the 5 days of free harvest labour you owe the Lord every September. A mill you're legally required to use and legally required to pay. A permission fee you need to spend a night away from home. A tax when your daughter marries, and when your father dies, before his body is cold, the best animal you own goes to the Lord as inheritance fee. Oh, and you legally can't sue anyone about any of this. That's Wolfham, Oxfordshire, year of our Lord 1286. One of about 10,000 villages across medieval England running on roughly this same logic. I make these sleep histories, and honestly, I have no idea if you're actually falling asleep to them or if you're all just warm people lying in clean beds, quietly enjoying the fact that nobody owns your labour. Either way, get comfortable. Pull the blanket up. Here we go. Your eyes open in darkness. Half a second where you don't know anything, where you're just a body in the black. Then it hits you. The smell. Not one smell. Never just one smell. Layers of it, stacked like bad decisions. Smoke first. Always smoke. The fire in the central hearth never goes completely out. Just banked down to embers at night. And the smoke from a week's burning has worked itself into every fibre of everything you own. Your blanket smells like smoke. Your hair smells like smoke. Your skin, if you pressed your nose to your own arm in the dark, smells like smoke cut through with something earthier. Something that's been building in this house since before you were born. Then the ox. Hilda is directly on the other side of the wattle partition that divides the longhouse into its 2 halves. You can hear her breathing, a wet, slow sound like someone stirring porridge. You can smell her. That particular warm animal stink that in summer makes you gag and in winter you're grateful for, because her body heat bleeds through the wickerwork and keeps the family side of the house from killing you outright. Then the midden pile, out back near the garden. Last night's rain has warmed it slightly. You'd rather not think about the specifics. Then your father. Not a bad smell exactly. Sweat and earth, and the particular acid of a man who hasn't bathed since the river got too cold to stand in, which was about 6 weeks ago. He's close. He slept 3 inches from your head, same as every night, which is both a testament to medieval housing and to the fact that 2 inches of air gap in November is not a luxury you can afford. Your mother beyond him, your little sister beyond her, curled into a ball like a dormouse, her breathing so light you have to watch for the rise and fall of her chest to be certain. Welcome to Wolfham, Oxfordshire, November, year of our Lord 1286. You are Thomas, son of William the ploughman. You are 17 years old. You have been 17 years old in this village, on this manor, in this longhouse, breathing this exact combination of smells for approximately 3 months. You will be 17 years old here for 9 more months, then 18, then 19, then 20, 30, 40. If the plague doesn't find you first, if the harvest doesn't fail, if the Lord doesn't increase his dues again in the spring. Outside, the dawn is still a suggestion, a faint thinning of the black behind the horn window, no bigger than your 2 fists pressed together. The village is beginning. You can hear it before you can see it. Someone's door creaking on its leather hinge. A dog objecting to the morning. The clink of someone's bucket on the way to the well that is technically the Lord's well, on the Lord's land. Everything here is technically the Lord's. The land, the water, the mill, the oven where you bake your bread. You. You lie there for a moment in the dark and the smell, and you think, today is a field day. Your own strips, not the Lord's. The difference matters. A week work day means you labour on the Lord's domain, ploughing his strips, spreading his muck, fixing his fences. A field day means you labour on your own ground. Your family's ground, holds by custom, not owns. You never own, you hold. At the Lord's pleasure, by ancient right, because your grandfather held it before your father, and his father before him, and so back into a time before anyone living can remember. It's yours. It's not yours. That particular contradiction is so woven into the fabric of daily life in Wolfham that most days it doesn't feel like a contradiction at all. It just feels like the shape of things. Today is a field day, and you need to get up. You sit up carefully. Your blanket is rough wool. The individual fibres scratchy against the back of your neck, slightly damp from your own breath condensing in the cold. You feel every fibre of it. The floor is hard packed earth. The cold comes up through your bare feet the moment they touch it. Immediate, specific, like a reprimand. Your boots are by the door. Your coarser work shirt hangs on the peg above them. Your father's good knife is tucked in the thatch above the hearth. High enough your sister can't reach it. Low enough he can find it in the dark without fumbling. Hilda shifts on her side of the partition, blows air through her nostrils, goes back to sleep. You do not have this luxury. The cold outside is different from the cold inside. Inside is close and layered. Outside is open and immediate and smells of nothing except frost and mud, and underneath that the faint brown rot of harvested fields. You stand outside your door for a moment, just breathing. The longhouse behind you is one of 14 on Wolfham's main street, which is not really a street so much as a track of churned earth running between the houses from the mill pond at one end to the church at the other, about 40 feet across at its widest, narrower where Roger Hayward's pigsty extends 3 feet into the common space without anyone formally complaining, because Roger is a large man and nobody wants that argument. The houses face each other across the mud, most built roughly the same way yours is, a timber frame filled with wattle and daub, thatched roof, small horn window, door facing the track, some longer than others. Adam the shepherd's is barely big enough for him and his wife. The Reeve's house at the far end, Geoffrey's house, who manages the manor for the Lord, is noticeably larger, has a separate animal buyer, has glares in at least one window, which on certain mornings catches the light and throws a small, impractical glimmer across the mud that everyone in Wolfham pretends not to notice. The Reeve, You'll think about the Reeve later. A woman is already at the well. Agnes, widow of the man who held the strips east of yours before he died of the coughing sickness 3 winters ago. She's perhaps 40 years old, which means she looks about 60. Her hands on the rope are so cracked and thickened the knuckles barely bend. She acknowledges you with a tilt of her head and goes back to winding. You cross the mud to where your family's toft ends and the lane begins. In November you can see the stripped earth of the common field, the stubble left from harvest, cold furrows catching the early light. Your family holds 7 strips across the 3 great fields, 3 in the north field, 2 in the south, 2 in the east, not adjacent, scattered, interspersed with other men's strips. This is deliberate, has been deliberate for generations. The good soil and the poor soil shared out roughly fairly, so no single family works only clay or only gravel. 7 strips of roughly an acre each. 7 acres theoretically to feed 5 people, minus what goes to the Lord in rent, minus the tithe to the church. 1 sheaf in 10 of everything you grow, minus the toll at the mill to grind your grain, minus the eggs you're expected to provide at Easter, the hens at Pentecost, minus the days you spend on the Lord's land during your own harvest season, watching your own grain stand ripe while you cut his, minus the accidents, the bad weather. The year the Westfield flooded in June and half the crop rotted standing. 7 acres is not as much as it sounds. You walk toward the field gate. The track is frozen this morning. Properly frozen. Last week's mud locked into the shapes it held when it was soft. Every boot print preserved in cold amber. Your feet feel every ridge through your boot soles, and the left boot has a seam separating at the toe. You've wrapped it with a strip of rag, twisted around the outside, tied at the ankle. In dry weather this helps. In wet weather it helps less. The cobbler in Wallingford could fix it properly for a farthing. Wallingford is 8 miles away. The Lord's permission to leave the manor overnight, officially required, never formally waived, carries a fee, and the fee is another quarter day's labour, and your labour is already spoken for 3 days out of every 6. So the boot goes unrepaired. You walk carefully around the worst of the mud. The strips in November. Your breath comes out in clouds. The frost on the field surface crunches under your step, and where it catches the early light it's silver, which is almost beautiful, except that your fingers are already numb enough that you're working them against your palm just to keep the blood moving. Your father is here before you. He's at the southern end of the Northfield strips, driving boundary pegs where your ground ends and old Edmund's begins. Edmund's son, Matthew, holds those strips now. Edmund died before the summer, and there's been a small dispute about exactly where the line runs, because Edmund wasn't always precise about his markers when he was alive, and Geoffrey the Reeve hasn't come out to measure. Meanwhile, both families are claiming a 3-foot-wide strip of scrub between the 2 holdings. 3 feet of scrub, a 20th of an acre maybe. In the middle of winter, in the mathematics of survival, that's a measurable quantity of next year's bread. Your father is driving the pegs in where he thinks they should go. You don't ask whether he's certain. You pick up the mallet and start spreading muck on the fallow strip 2 rows east. The muck is from the midden. You loaded it into the hand barrow before the proper light came, working by feel, shoveling the cold, decomposed matter, straw, dung, kitchen waste, and the organic chaos a medieval family generates in steady quantity, into the barrow, your fingers clumsy with cold, the smell of it working up into your eyes so they watered. Now you're spreading it. scooping with a flat wooden spade, casting left and right, working backward down the strip. The stuff is semi-frozen on the outside and actively unpleasant in the middle. When you hit a pocket of something more liquid, the splash reaches higher than it should. Your forearm, your chin. You wipe your chin on your sleeve. Your sleeve is already past the point of caring. This is what improving the land looks like. It looks like nothing from the outside. An acre of dark, roughly churned earth with muck thrown across it. By spring, the soil will be marginally better for it. The barley in this strip, if the weather is right, if you have seed to plant and time to plant it, might yield 5 or 6 bushels to the acre. In your father's grandfather's time, these strips yielded 3 or 4. Very slowly it's getting better. The work is rhythmic enough that your mind can leave it. Your arms work the spade. Your feet carry you backward. Your eyes note the boundary markers. And your thoughts go to Robert. Robert, son of Will the Smith, 20 years old. Taller than you by a full head, which is partly his forge diet. Meat more often than most, and partly just what Robert is. Dark-haired, reckless in the specific way of certain people who don't yet understand what recklessness costs. Last week at the well, Robert told you something. He said, "Oxford." You said, "What about it?" He said, "A year and a day." You know about a year and a day. You did not know about a year and a day. He told you. The law, English law, the common law, the kind that applies to free men and occasionally, in certain circumstances to others, says this: if a serf escapes from his lord's manor and makes it to a chartered borough, a town with a royal charter, and lives there for a year and a day without being claimed by his lord, he becomes free. By custom, by law, by the passage of time, a year and a day. Oxford has a royal charter. Oxford is 8 miles from Wolfham. You could walk to Oxford in an afternoon. You've been turning this over ever since. The way you turn a stone in your pocket, wearing down the edges, coming back to the same smooth weight of it again and again. Your father doesn't know Robert told you this. Or if he knows, he hasn't mentioned it. Your father has a way of not mentioning certain things. Things that lead to conversations, that lead to hopes, that lead to disappointment or worse. Your father is 42 years old, and he has the posture of a man who decided at some point that certain doors don't open for people like him, and it's better to stop looking at the doors. You are 17. You are still looking at the doors. Here's what I mean when I say bound. Because when I say it, I need you to understand what that actually meant. In its full, technical, legally enforced, utterly mundane reality. This isn't figurative. This isn't poverty trapping you. This isn't economic pressure making it difficult to leave. This is actual law. You're a villein, a serf. In Latin, the documents call you servus terrae, slave of the earth. Not of a person, of the earth itself. The land holds you. You were born into a family that held villein land and that made you a villein. And being a villein means your legal personhood is approximately as extensive as the legal personhood of one of Hilda's calves. Not nothing, but constrained in specific documented ways. Here's how the constraint works. Every Monday, Wednesday and Friday, you owe the Lord of Wolfham Manor, currently Sir Robert de Vere, who inherited the estate from his father 4 years ago and has visited twice. 3 days of labour on his domain, his home farm, his 200 acres of better quality land, worked by the labour of his villeins, without payment for your entire working life. That's week work. 3 days in every 6 on his land, not yours. It doesn't matter what's happening on your own strips. It doesn't matter if your crops need attention. It doesn't matter if you're ill, if it's your wife's childbirth, if your ox went lame. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you appear at the demesne gate, and the Reeve checks his tally, and you work. And then there are the boon works, harvest time, the weeks when your grain and the Lord's grain ripen simultaneously, and the law says whose happens first. The Lord calls boon works, extra days, all your working family members expected, your wife and older children included. You harvest his grain first. In exchange, the Lord provides food during boon works, bread and ale, and sometimes a bit of meat. This is called the precaria, the prayer, the boon, as if you're being invited, as if there's a choice, and there's the merchant. If your daughter wants to marry, you pay the Lord for permission. The fine varies, a few pence, sometimes more, and it isn't optional. A villein who marries off his daughter without the merchant is breaking Lord's custom. The penalty for that is worse than the original payment, and there's the heriot. When your father dies, when William the ploughman finishes his last furrow, the Lord gets the best beast in your possession, your best ox, Hilda. Before your family can inherit the strips, before you can formally take on the holding, Hilda must go to the manor. You've thought about this in the cold, practical way that only people who've grown up knowing it's coming can think about it. Your father dies, the Reeve arrives, takes Hilda. Now you have one ox where you had two, and you plough 7 acres with half the draft power, and the year your father dies is also the year your margin gets razor thin. And there's the mill suit. Your grain must be ground at the Lord's mill, not a neighbour's quern, not a hand mill in your own house. Those are technically illegal. The Lord can confiscate them. Geoffrey the Reeve once walked into Agnes the widow's house and carried out the small quern she'd been using in the evenings to save the toll. He didn't apologise. She didn't argue. The mill takes 1/20 of what you bring, 1 in 20. By the time your grain is flour, you've lost a fraction of it to the privilege of getting it ground. Everything costs, and through all of it you cannot be taken to a royal court. You cannot sue your lord in the king's court because a villein has no standing in common law. You can only go to the manor court, the Hallmote, the Lord's own court, administered by his own Reeve, where the judge is functionally the Lord's representative, and the jury is your neighbours, who are also villains and also afraid. You're not outside the law, you are under it, in a specific and documented way, and you cannot leave. Wednesday, a week work day. You go to the demesne gate at dawn, your breath clouds in the cold air. The track is soft this morning. Yesterday's sun thawed the top inch of mud back to its natural state, and your boots sink slightly with each step, a sucking resistance you feel up through the calf on the way up. The demesne is the Lord's home farm 600 yards from the village on the high, well-drained ground above the river bend. Sir Robert's grandfather chose this spot. Everything since has organised itself around it. The house, the barns, the croft garden, the dovecote, full of doves that eat your crops, which is their right. The Reeve, Geoffrey, stands at the gate with his tally stick. He makes a notch when you arrive. He makes another if you're late. He'll make a third if the work you do is not satisfactory, which is a judgment call. He makes. There are 9 of you this morning. The number varies. The work today is hedging. The great hedge along the eastern boundary of the domain has grown wild over summer and needs laying, cut and woven into a dense barrier that cattle can't break through. It's skilled work. Your father does it well. You're learning. The tools are the Lord's tools. distributed from the barn, billhooks with wooden handles worn smooth by years of hands. The blades are sharp this morning. The manor smith has been at them, and the weight sits comfortably in your palm, a familiar weight. Your palm has learned the weight the way it's learned everything else worth knowing. You work alongside your father, and beside him Richard Hayward, and beyond him the two youngest carpenter boys. Nobody talks much in the first hour. The work fills the space. Slash, step, weave, bend. The living wood of the hawthorn flexible and uncooperative at once. The thorns extracting their own toll from your forearms and the backs of your hands. Your hands. God, your hands. The knuckles are thickened from this kind of labour. The palms are layered with callus 3 generations deep, it feels like. In winter they crack at the joints. The cracks don't heal properly in the cold. They fill with field dirt and ache in the frost and open slightly when you flex them wrong. You flex your right hand now, just testing. The ridge at the base of your index finger splits open. A thin red line. You close your fist and go back to the hedging. Geoffrey walks the line twice in the morning watching the work. He says nothing. Doesn't need to. His presence is the commentary. When his footsteps stop behind you, you work more carefully. When they move on, you breathe normally. At midday, the Lord's servant brings bread and ale from the manor house. You eat sitting on the cold ground, your back against the raw hedge bank, the bread coarse enough to scrape your tongue on the inner crust. The ale is thin, barely fermented, not much alcohol but wet and cold and better than the ditch water you'd otherwise be drinking. You eat every bite, you drink everything in the cup. Beside you, Thomas Carpenter eats with the focused efficiency of someone who's learned not to waste time on things like enjoyment. You've known Thomas your whole life. 17 years of knowing someone in a place this size makes them as familiar as furniture. He says between mouthfuls, "Heard Robert Smith's been talking about leaving." You keep chewing. "Heard what?" You know what. He looks at you the way you look at someone whose face you can read even when it isn't showing anything. He told half the village by now. He shouldn't have. No. Thomas breaks off a piece of bread. He shouldn't have. Pause. Would you? He asks. You look out at the hedgerow, the cold November sky, the distant smudge of Wallingford's church tower, just visible from here on clear days. Today is clear enough. Ask me something I can answer, you say. Thomas makes a sound that might be a laugh, might be agreement. You eat the rest of your bread in silence. Geoffrey the Reeve. You need to understand Geoffrey before this goes further, because Geoffrey is the system made flesh, not the Lord. You barely know the Lord. Sir Robert de Vere is a name on documents, a signature, a twice-yearly presence. Distant lords are counterintuitively more bearable than present ones. A lord who never shows up can't decide on impulse to increase your dues. A lord who never shows up can't ride past your field and decide your strips should actually be his. Geoffrey shows up every day. He's from the village, born here. His father held the position before him, which is how it goes, theoretically elected by the village. But when Geoffrey's father died, the manor needed someone immediately, and Geoffrey was the obvious choice, and the election was noted in the court rolls and considered complete. He's 47, a compact man who moves as if the ground is his property, which in a certain functional sense it is. He has a wife, 3 children, a solid house, glass in the window. He's a villein same as you, same legal status technically, but he exercises the Lord's authority in the Lord's name, and the distance between villein and villain who speaks for the Lord is larger than the legal similarity suggests. He's not cruel. That's the complicated thing about Geoffrey. He's not cruel the way a man can be cruel when he enjoys it. He's cruel the way a system can be cruel when it has no feelings. He notes the tally, applies the custom, enforces the Hallmote judgment, collects the dues. Because that's what he does. He does it consistently. He does it without particular emotion. Widows don't get special consideration because they're widows. The sick don't get exemptions unless the exemption is written in manor custom. If it's not written, Geoffrey doesn't invent mercy. He doesn't fail to invent it out of cruelty either. He simply doesn't invent it. He knows everyone's business. Naturally, a village of 240 people, a Reeve who's lived here his whole life. He knows who owes what, who's been late, who's running a handquern in secret, who's been selling at market without declaring the income for the relevant tallage. He knew, you're relatively certain, before you did that Robert had been asking questions about Oxford. He hasn't done anything yet, which means he's waiting for Robert to actually try something, or he's holding what he knows as leverage, or he's already spoken to Robert privately in a way you haven't heard. Any of those options is possible. You think about this as you finish the last section of Hedge in the afternoon, your arms burning, the light going from gold to grey. Geoffrey makes his inspection, notes something in the tally, doesn't acknowledge you. You push the last stake into the cold ground. Done. Free until Friday. Free is a word that means something specific and limited in Wolfham. There's a man at the edge of the village who knows things. Old Hugh Cottager, though that's not really his surname. Hugh doesn't have a surname in any useful sense. He lives in the small cot at the lane's end, the one that's been repaired so many times with so many different materials it looks like a physical record of every bad winter in living memory. He has perhaps 60 years, maybe more. He has one working eye, the other clouded from some old damage, and he uses the good one with the focused attention of a man making the most of what remains. He was never a ploughman. He's a cottager, a lesser category of villein, holding only a quarter acre of garden ground, owing fewer labour days, but also surviving on the narrow margin of skill rather than the slightly less narrow margin of 7 acres. He repairs things, baskets, tools, harness leather, the wooden parts of ploughs. He does it slowly and extremely well. People bring him broken objects and come back to find them better than they were. He also knows law, not formally. Hugh has never met a lawyer, can't read a word. But he's been alive 60 years in a village that lives and dies by custom and manorial rights, and he's watched every dispute that ever played out in the Hallmote, and he's talked to travellers on the Oxford Road, and he's spoken with monks from the priory 4 miles east. Somewhere in 60 years he assembled a picture of how things work that is more accurate than anything you learned from your father. Your father, who stopped looking at certain doors. You come to Hugh on a Thursday afternoon, your own day, not the Lord's, with a leather hinge from your house door that's cracked through. You could fix it yourself, probably. You've watched Hugh often enough. But the hinge is an excuse, and you're both aware of it. He examines the hinge, presses the crack with his thumb, makes a sound. Sit down then, he says, without you having asked anything yet. You sit on the bench outside his door. The day is grey and still, the kind of cold that settles rather than bites. The smell of his fire comes through the wall, a different wood from yours, pine maybe, or the cording he sometimes burns. You're thinking about it, Hugh says, already working the leather, pressing it over a wooden form. I'm thinking about a lot of things. Don't. He doesn't look up. It's already in your face. The young ones always wear it first in their faces. The young ones who what? The young ones who hear about a year and a day. Silence. A crow in the elm at the lane's end makes a series of sounds that aren't quite words, but feel like commentary. Is it true? You ask. Hugh is quiet for a moment. His hands work the leather. It's true, he says. The law says it. Royal decree from when the boroughs got their charters. A man who's resided in a borough for a year and a day without being claimed by his lord is accounted a free man. So. He sets the hinge down, looks at you with the one working eye, and there's nothing soft in it. Let me tell you about the things that are also true. He holds up one finger. First, your lord has a right to send men to retrieve you within the year and a day. He has men. The steward at Wallingford works for 3 manors, including this one. He knows the faces of every villain bound to this estate. Second finger. Second, to stay in Oxford for a year and a day, you need to eat. To eat, you need work. To get work, a master in Oxford will want to know who you are and where you're from. And when you tell him, if he's cautious, which the ones with lasting workshops tend to be, he's going to wonder if you're someone's runaway. Third finger. Third, the year and a day works perfectly as law. As practice, it's used mainly by free men moving between boroughs, by people who have someone in the town already, a cousin, an old neighbour, a churchman who owes a favour, someone to give them work and housing in the critical first months without asking too many questions. He picks up the hinge again. You have come on in Oxford. You think about it. Your mother's brother moved to Oxford 30 years ago and died of something wet. You know no one there. No, you say. Hugh nods as if this was the answer he expected. Then the law is true, he says, but the path to using it is harder than the law itself. That's how most laws work. He examines the leather, satisfied, hands it back. I'm not saying don't think about it, Hugh says. He doesn't look at you. I'm saying think about it properly. Think about all of it, not just the freedom at the end. He goes inside. The door closes. You stand in the lane with the repaired hinge in your hand, and the crow in the elm making its sounds, and the smell of frost coming in from the fields. You think about it. You think about all of it. September was the test. I want to go back there, because September is when you see the system most clearly, when the Lord's harvest and your harvest happen simultaneously, and the law says whose happens first. The Reeves notice came in late August. Nailed to the church door, Wolfham's closest thing to a bulletin board, announcing the date of the precaria, the boon work, the 5 days of harvest labour, all full-holding villains owe the Lord when he calls them. 5 days. 5 days while your grain is standing ripe and the sky is good, and every hour you delay is an hour closer to the rain that ruins everything, and you're in the Lord's field cutting his grain and watching the good weather over your shoulder. You were in the domain field at dawn, 12 full-holding villains, their wives and older children, working with sickles while the bailiff walked the headland, and the Reeve watched and noted. The sickle work is brutal on the back. You cut crouched, grabbing a sheaf with your left hand, drawing the curved blade close to the ground with your right, releasing the cut sheaf to fall, grabbing the next, grab, cut, release, grab, cut, release. The rhythm starts feeling automatic around the second hour and starts feeling impossible around the fifth. Your back doesn't straighten. Not really. It thinks it straightens between cuttings when you stand to carry the sheaves to the binder. But the particular compression of crouched harvest work follows you even when you're upright. By midday, there's a constant, low, specific ache lodged in the muscle above the hip. You know this ache. Your father has it permanently. You've watched it in him. The careful few seconds every morning before the back agrees to cooperate. This is what you're inheriting. The bailiff, Lawrence, a hired man from Wallingford, with the general air of someone meant for better things who hasn't made peace with the gap, walked the work at intervals. He said little. He looked at the pace, the tightness of the bindings, the evenness of the rows. Once he bent and picked up a sheaf someone had bound loosely, held it up for everyone to see, shook it slightly, grain heads dropping onto the ground. Nobody said anything. Richard Hayward's wife, who'd bound it, tied the next sheaf tighter without expression. The food came at midday. Better than your ordinary days. Wheaten bread, not the maslin mix you usually ate. Actual white flour loaves. Properly fermented ale. A pot of pottage with actual meat in it. Pork, probably from the Lord's own animals. You ate it sitting in the field, the cut strips around you, the smell of fresh grain hanging in still air. It was the best meal of the week, and you knew, while you ate it, that it was calculated. The bread and pottage were part of the system. They kept you working. They made the boon work feel less like compulsion and more like a shared enterprise. They softened the fact that you were harvesting someone else's grain while your own stood waiting. Clever, really. If you're the Lord or the Lord's man, thinking about how to extract 5 days of unpaid labour from people who have every reason to resent you, a good midday meal is economically rational. It costs a few loaves and a pot of pottage. It buys a marginally less resentful afternoon. You ate every bite of it. On the 6th day, finally the Lord's harvest was in. On the 7th day you started on your own. The weather held. Just. The rain came on the 10th day, the steady grey curtain of it sweeping in from the west, and everything not yet cut had to be cut in the wet, which meant the sheaves needed extra drying time, which meant a higher risk of mould. You got it all in eventually. You lost some to the damp, not as much as some years. But when you saw the rain coming, when you felt the first drops on the back of your neck, the first thing you thought was, if we hadn't spent 5 days on his field. That thought was not safe to say out loud. You didn't say it out loud. Your neighbour Edmund died in September. Edmund the man, not Edmund the ox. He had perhaps 50 years. He'd been ill since summer, the kind of ill that lives in the chest and makes a wet sound when he breathes, and in late August it got worse, and by early September he was gone. His son Matthew is your age, give or take. 3 days after Edmund was buried in the churchyard, Geoffrey the Reeve came to Matthew's house. You weren't there. You heard it from Matthew later, from the careful way he described it, the voice that wasn't quite steady. Geoffrey arrived in the morning. He had the tally stick. He explained, not unkindly, that the Heriot was due. Edmund's best beast to be given to the Lord's manor as acknowledgement that the holding was passing to the next generation. Matthew's family had 1 ox, 3 goats, 6 chickens. The ox went with Geoffrey. Matthew came to your house that evening and sat by your fire and said nothing for a long time. His mother, in a house across the track, had been crying since the afternoon. You could hear it in the quiet evening. Your mother gave Matthew bread. He ate it slowly. "We'll manage," he said eventually. You didn't know what to say. "You can use oars when you need it," your father said, "when the ploughing comes. Edmund would have done the same." Matthew nodded. He didn't look grateful exactly. He looked like someone adding up a column of numbers and finding the sum keeps coming out wrong. His father was dead. His ox was gone. He had 7 acres to farm in spring with no draft animal. His father's labour due to fulfil for the rest of his working life, and a mother to feed. That's what mourning looked like in Wolfham. The grief was real. The system waited approximately 3 days for the grief and then kept moving. You thought about the Heriot for days afterward, about Hilda, your stronger ox, about what that morning would look like when William the ploughman died, Geoffrey at the door with the tally, the matter-of-fact instruction the animal led away. You thought about how there was no version of the future where it didn't happen unless you obtained formal manumission, which costs money you don't have, or unless you escaped before it became relevant. 1 year and 1 day, in Oxford, where you know nobody, and the steward of Wallingford knows your face. Robert Smith told you he was going in the first week of November. You were at the mill, both of you, waiting for the grinding. The wheel turned. The grinding stone worked. The mill smelled of damp stone and flour dust, and the particular closed-in cold of a stone building over moving water. Robert, who'd had the look for weeks of someone who's been deciding something, said, "I'm going in 3 days." You kept your voice low. The miller's boy was in earshot. "Where?" "Oxford. What else?" "You've thought about—" "I've thought about everything." He said it with the flat certainty of someone who's done the calculation and chosen to ignore several variables. "My mother's free. Her father came here as a free tenant. She's free. She never married into villein land. She had me with my father, who did hold villein land, which is how I got this." He gestured at himself at the whole situation. "But if anyone looks properly, I've got a case that I might be free already." You looked at him. "Have you talked to anyone about that case? A lawyer? A churchman who knows law?" "I'll find someone in Oxford." "Geoffrey knows," you said. "Geoffrey knows about everything you've said. He probably already wrote to Wallingford." Robert's jaw tightened. "Then I need to go before they decide to do something about it." "Or you need to not go and not give them anything to act on." "Or," Robert said, "I need to go now, be in Oxford before the first snow, find work, last a year and a day, and come back a free man." He picked up his grain sack. The miller's boy appeared in the doorway. The conversation was over. You thought about it the whole way home, not whether he was right or wrong, not whether the plan was good or bad. You thought about how it felt. From inside this village, from inside the specific mud of this track and the smoke of this house, and the cold reality of these 7 strips, to watch someone look at the Oxford road and say, "I'm going to take it." It felt like standing at the edge of water in November. Possible, not comfortable. Robert left before dawn on a Tuesday. You knew it was happening. He'd told you the night before when you met briefly behind the church. Not conspiratorially, not like men in a plan, just 2 people standing in the dark talking, which from the outside would have looked like nothing. "If I make it," he said, "if I send word back somehow, I'll know," you said. "And if I don't, I'll know that too." He put out his hand. You shook it. His grip was his father's grip. Heavy, work-hardened, the grip of a man who'd spent his childhood swinging a hammer. "Don't say anything," he said. "Not to Geoffrey, obviously." Obviously. He walked off into the dark. You stood behind the church for a moment, the cold pressing through your coat. The church had been here since before anyone alive could remember. Norman stones, thick and deliberate, the marks of chisels left by men 200 years dead. People were born and died and married and buried in Wolfham, and the church received them all, and the stones didn't care. You walked home, lay down in the dark, listened to your father breathing. The village outside was completely silent. No wind, the kind of cold quiet that feels like the world has held its breath. You thought, he's probably already past the mill. You thought, if Geoffrey has someone watching the road. You thought, a year and a day. You thought about what a year felt like from inside it, how September had felt like it would last forever, and November came anyway. 366 mornings waking in a different bed, a different smell, a different city, a different set of fears. At the end of it, being a different kind of person in the law's eyes. You fell asleep with that thought still moving. 3 days passed, then 4, nothing. No one said anything. The village kept its daily rhythm. Morning work, evening return, women at the well, men at the fields, Geoffrey making his rounds. On the 5th day, Geoffrey came to your father's house in the evening. William was eating. Your mother stopped moving. Your sister felt the temperature change in the room and went very still. Geoffrey said, "William, you know where Robert Smith went?" Not a question. Your father set down his spoon. Heard he went to Abingdon. Business for his father. Robert's father hasn't sent anyone to Abingdon in 3 years. I wouldn't know his business. Geoffrey looked at William. William looked at Geoffrey. This was 2 men who'd known each other their entire lives in a place this size. The formality of the exchange was a formality they both understood perfectly. The Lord Steward in Wallingford is aware of the situation, Geoffrey said. Anyone in this village who assists Robert in his absence, provides him with food, shelter, or information, will be considered in violation of the Lord's custom. There's a precedent in the court rolls from 40 years ago. John of the Hollow tried a similar thing. His family paid the fine for 3 years. He left. The door closed. Your father picked up his spoon, went back to eating. Your mother sat down. Your sister looked at you. You looked at the fire. After a long time, your father said, "Robert Smith's a fool." You didn't answer. "He's not wrong," your father said slower, "but he's a fool." Still you said nothing. "The difference," your father said, "between being right and being safe isn't nothing. It isn't nothing, Thomas." You thought about that for a long time. You're still thinking about it. On a Sunday in October, before Robert left, back when the harvest was finishing and the world smelled of cut grain and wood smoke, you climbed the church tower. No real reason. Osbert, who normally rang the afternoon bell, was ill. Someone needed to ring it. You were in the wrong place at the wrong moment, which turned out to be the right moment. You rang the bell, felt the rope's great pull through your whole body, the tone filling the stone space and going out through the louvers into the October air. And then, instead of coming down immediately, you stayed, because from the louver openings, narrow, pointed, designed to let sound out and keep weather in, you could see. You could see everything. Wolfham spread below you, and the surprise of it was the smallness. The 14 houses on their track of mud. The church and the mill and Geoffrey's glass-windowed house. The common field stretching in 3 directions. The strips partially cut. The colours of autumn. The river making its loop to the east. The trees along it, their leaves going. And the road. the Oxford Road, running straight as an intention from the village's south end along the ridge to the horizon. You could see it for perhaps 2 miles before it bent and disappeared behind the hill. You'd walked that road once when you were 12, with your father's permission, to meet a cart from Abingdon bringing iron for the smith. The boundary of the manor was marked by a particular oak tree, old enough nobody alive remembered its planting, about 1.5 miles from the village centre. You'd gone to the tree and come back, and that was the farthest from Wolfham you'd ever been. From the tower, you could see past the tree. The road continued. It continued eventually to Oxford. You thought about the men who built this tower, Normans or their English workers, men who knew other places, men who'd travelled. The mason who cut those stones had come from somewhere and gone somewhere else. The road itself had existed before the village, before the manor, before the conquest. Roman line, Hugh had told you once, built to connect places that mattered to the Romans, and it had outlasted them by 800 years, and it would outlast Wolfham too. The road didn't care whether you were villein or free. The road just went. You stood in the tower louver, the October wind coming through the gap, the smell of it carrying cold and distance and something you couldn't name. The feeling of the bell rope was still in your palms, the vibration of it. You thought about what you could see from here that you couldn't see from the ground. You thought about how much more there was beyond what you could see from here. And then Osbert's daughter came into the tower to fetch you back because the rope shouldn't be left unattended, and you came down the stairs and went back into the village and the cold. They caught Robert on the 14th day. The steward of Wallingford had sent 2 men to Oxford at the first word from Geoffrey. They knew where to look. The apprentice houses near the tanning quarter, where new arrivals tended to end up. Robert had found work with a tanner in Oxford, which is either irony or simply bad luck, the tanning district being exactly where they looked first. He'd been there 11 days. They brought him back on a cold Tuesday morning. 2 men on horses with Robert walking between them, his wrists not bound, but the horses positioned close enough that the implied constraint was complete. He walked the last half-mile through the morning mud, and everyone who saw it, and nobody said a word. The Hallmote was called for Thursday. The manor court met in the great hall of the manor house, a table at one end where Geoffrey sat as presiding officer, benches along the walls where the 12 jurors, all villeins of the manor chosen by the custom of the lot, sat in their places. You were a juror. All full-holding men were eligible. Your lot came up. You sat on the bench. Robert stood in the central space. He'd been sleeping in the Reeves barn since Tuesday. He had mud on his boots and a bruise on one cheekbone that nobody explained. Geoffrey read the charge from the court roll in his flat administrative voice. Thomas, son of William of Wolfham, held villein tenure, had absented himself from the manor without permission, had travelled to the royal borough of Oxford where he had sought employment, had been present in the borough for 11 days before being recovered, and was now before the court to answer for his breach of the Lord's custom. The custom was clear. The documentation was complete. Robert looked straight ahead while this was read. His hands were clasped in front of him. He'd gotten taller in the year since you'd both turned 15 together. He looked taller than everyone in the room right now, which might have been just where he was standing in the open space while everyone else sat along the walls. The jurors were asked to deliberate. There was not much to deliberate. The custom was clear. The fact was not in dispute. 2 of the 12 jurors were Robert's father's friends. They all looked at the floor, guilty of absence without permission. guilty of seeking to establish illegal residence in a chartered borough. The fine was assessed. 8 shillings. 8 shillings. Approximately 2 months' wages for a free labourer. For a family with no wages, it became concrete in the form of additional labour obligations and the confiscation of certain property. The details would be worked out later. Additional punishment. Robert was to present himself at the manor gate on every work-day for the next 6 months, to be personally checked against the tally. No absences without advance permission documented in the court roll. It was over in 20 minutes. Robert walked out of the hall into the November light, and the village resumed around him, and the sentence began its quiet work of converting his attempt into a cage. You walked home after, through the mud, alone. You thought about 11 days. He'd made it 11 days. If he'd had someone in Oxford, a cousin, an uncle, a churchman who owed a favour, maybe he'd have made it through the dangerous first weeks, when a new face is still new and the Lord's men know where to look. Maybe past the first month, when work becomes routine and a new man stops being unusual. Maybe. You thought about what Hugh had said. Think about it properly. Think about all of it. You thought about 8 shillings. You thought about Robert's face in the hall, the way he'd kept looking forward. Not defiant. Defiance would have been a choice, a statement. He was just looking forward, the way you look at something that's happened and can't be changed. You thought about your own name on the court roll document. Thomas Filius Wilhelmi, Thomas son of William, the road southwest, visible from the tower running straight. Your mother made pottage that evening, the usual thick mix, barley, dried beans, leeks from the garden, bolstered by a bone she'd gotten from Agnes, who'd slaughtered one of her goats. Your mother could make a bone last 3 days of cooking. The 4 of you sat around the fire. Your sister said, "Is Robert going?" "To be all right." Your father said, "He'll be all right." Your mother said nothing. She stirred the pottage, which didn't need stirring. "Will they do anything else to him?" your sister asked. "That's the end of it," your father said. "He pays the fine. He works the obligation. In 6 months it's done." "He'll remember," your sister said. Nobody answered that. You ate your pottage. The beans were slightly underdone, which gave them a particular hardness at the centre that you worked with your back teeth. The broth was good. The bone had done its work. There was actual flavour in it. Salt and marrow and the sweetness of the leeks. Your father said, "To the fire or to the room or to nobody." The rule is the rule because it has to be the rule. A manor works because people stay. You let one go free and the next one goes and the next, and eventually there's nobody left to work the fields. The rule isn't cruelty, it's the shape of the thing. You said, "Is it not possible for the thing to have a different shape?" He was quiet for a moment. "When I was young," he said, "I thought the same. Then I grew up. And I'm still here," he said, simply. "I have you and your mother and your sister and 7 strips and the work isn't done. I'm still here." He said it without bitterness. That was the thing. He said it the way you state a fact about weather. You thought about the view from the tower, the road going southwest, still here, late January, a Tuesday. You came back to Hugh's cot, not with a broken object this time. He was inside, running a length of rope through his hands methodically, feeling for weaknesses. His breath was visible even inside the house. The fire was very small. "You want to ask me something," he said. "Several things." "Ask them." You sat on the same bench, cold wood through your breeches. "Is there any other way?" you asked. "Not the year and a day, something safer." Hugh kept working the rope. "There's manumission," he said. "Lord grants you your freedom, formally, in writing, witnessed by the church. It's been done. Not common, but done. How much money? 4 or 5 marks for a full-holding family, maybe more. You calculated. A mark was 13 shillings and 4 pence. 4 marks was something close to 53 shillings. At the pace a villein household accumulated anything surplus. A penny here, a few eggs sold at market there. That was perhaps 40 years of saving, without any of those savings being consumed by a bad harvest, an illness, a heriot, an unexpected fine. The other way," Hugh said, "is the church. A man who takes priest orders is technically freed from villein status. The Lord can't claim him once he's ordained. I can't read. You could learn." Silence. "You're serious?" "I'm serious." He held the rope up to the weak light, found the fray he was looking for, and set to work. "The priory at St. Frideswide's in Oxford takes novices, young men. Some learn to read, some take orders. It takes years, and you'd be trading one kind of life for another, but it's a different constraint. Would the Lord try to stop me? He could contest it. He's within his rights to claim you before ordination, but once it's done, a man in priest's orders belongs to the church and to God, and the Lord has no claim." He finished the repair, held the rope up, satisfied. "I'm not telling you to do any of this," Hugh said. "I'm answering your question. What would you tell me to do?" Hugh looked at you then, the good eye holding yours for a moment in the precise way it did when he was being exact. "I would tell you to learn to read," he said, "whatever you do with it after. A man who can read is a different kind of man. He can see the documents that contain his name. He can understand the court rolls. He can know what's being done to him, and in what precise terms and why." He handed you the repaired rope. "Learn to read, then decide." The last Sunday of January. Father William came to Wolfham for the service. He was a thin man, thin in the way of someone who genuinely forgot to eat, rather than the thin of someone who couldn't afford to. His robes slightly too long, repaired at the hem several times. He smelled of tallow and parchment. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the grey morning, you waited, deliberately. On the porch, in the cold, while people passed you making their Sunday greetings, your father went past with a look that asked a question you didn't answer. You waited until it was just you and Father William checking the candlesticks. "Father," you said. He turned. "I want to learn to read." He regarded you with the expression of a man encountering a request he'd seen approximately twice before, in 20 years of parish work. One of those times leading somewhere interesting. "What would you read?" he asked. "Anything, to start. Then, I want to be able to read a court document, the kind the manor court keeps." Something shifted in his expression. He understood the implication. A villein who could read his own court rolls. "Come to the church on Tuesday evenings," he said, "after Vespers bell. Bring a candle." He went back to checking the candlesticks. You walked out into the January morning. Something had changed in the orientation of things. Not in the village. The village was exactly the same. The mud and the smoke and the 14 houses and Geoffrey's window catching no light in the grey morning. The air was the same cold. The road southwest was the same road. But something had changed. Like a door that had been, until now, simply a wall. Tuesday evenings at the church. The first lesson, the letters. Father William wrote them in charcoal on a flat board, the 23 letters of the English alphabet, and you stared at them and understood that each mark had a sound, and sounds in combination made words, and that this was, when you thought about it clearly, an absurdly simple system for containing everything ever written. You couldn't understand why it took so long to learn. It didn't take as long as he expected. You could tell because he kept resetting the pace, moving faster, and you kept staying with him. And after the third session, he looked at you across the candle with an expression that was not quite wonder, but was the shadow of it. "You've done this before," he said. "Never." "Then you were meant for it." The cold in the church was serious, the kind that works in through stone walls and holds there, patient, unmoved by your single candle. You wore your coat and your hands were stiff, and writing, when he let you try, was physically difficult in a way that had nothing to do with the letters. But the letters came. By March you could read a simple sentence. By April, a paragraph. And eventually, slowly, the Latin of the church service, with occasional help. You read it aloud in the cold church and your breath came out in clouds, and the words that 2 centuries of documents had contained became sounds in your mouth. This didn't change your legal status. Let's be very clear about that. Learning to read didn't alter your labour dues, your place in Wolfham's structure, your name on the court roll. But Hugh was right about what it changed. You could see the documents. You understood the forms of the court rolls, the specific Latin phrases that described your tenure. You could read it. You could read your own name in it. Thomas Filius Wilhelmi. Thomas, son of William. There you were, on the parchment, in the court roll, and in the margin, in a different hand, slightly older ink, Et nativis manori, and he is a serf of the manor. You read it. You held that. April brought the new problem. Sir Robert de Vere visited the manor. Not a brief inspection, a genuine stay, 3 weeks with his household. His wife, 2 servants, a steward, and a chaplain who sat in the front pew during Father William's service with the expression of a man used to a cathedral. Sir Robert was 31, a tall man, reasonably well fed, with the posture of someone told since birth that posture matters. He walked the daymen in the mornings, he went hunting in the afternoons, he held a Hallmote in the first week. The Hallmote produced an announcement. The Lord had reviewed the customs of the manor against his current needs, and had determined that labour dues from full holding villeins were to increase by 1 additional day per week, 1 additional day, from 3 to 4. This was within his legal rights. Manor custom defined the minimum obligation. It didn't cap the maximum. He was asking for more. 4 days per week meant 2 days for your family's fields, 2 days to grow food for 5 people. The village heard this in absolute silence in the hall. Geoffrey read it from the document. Your father, sitting 3 men down from you on the bench, sat very still. Outside afterward, people stood in the mud for a moment before dispersing. Your father said, "That's going to be hard." Robert's father, the smith, said, "It'll break some families." Nobody answered that. Matthew, whose father had died in September, said nothing at all. He did the calculation in his head, and you could watch him doing it. The arithmetic of survival, and the sum kept coming out wrong. 3 weeks after the announcement, Geoffrey found a small quern in Adam Shepherd's house. Adam was 60. His wife was dead. He had 1 daughter, married in the next village. He lived alone with minimal livestock, farming a small holding by himself since his last son died of fever. Geoffrey took the quern. Adam said nothing, watched it go. The quern was illegal. Grinding grain outside the Lord's mill was a breach of mill suit obligations. The rule existed to protect the mill's income. Adam had been using it to save himself perhaps a 16th of his grain per grinding. A 16th of his grain. In the middle of winter, you were walking past on your way to the south field when Geoffrey emerged from Adam's door with the quern under his arm. Adam stood in his doorway. You kept walking. Later that day you came back with half a loaf of bread. Your mother's bread. She'd known you were going. Adam looked at the bread. His face did something complicated. He took it. "You'll get yourself in trouble," he said. "Just bread," you said. "Right." He was quiet. Then, "Your old man's a good man. You take after him." He went back inside. You stood in the lane. Your old man's a good man, you thought, who stopped looking at the doors. Both things can be true. You're starting to understand that. And when I say it felt like being trapped, I need you to understand what that actually means in the body, not as a political statement, as a physical daily experience. It's not like a cage. A cage has bars you can see. This is more like you know the direction you can't go. You know it the way you know not to step in the flooded ditch. The knowledge is so embedded that most days you don't notice it. Most days you walk the same paths you always walk, and the boundary is simply not in your way, because you're not heading in that direction. But on certain days when the sky's particularly clear and the view from the ridge is particularly long, days when a traveller comes through on the Oxford Road and stops at the well and drinks and moves on, moving with the easy assumption of a person who goes where they want to go. Days when someone comes back from Abingdon Market with the smell of a different place on their coat and a slightly woken look, the look of someone who's been somewhere. On those days the boundary is not theoretical. It's the specific edge of the manor marked by the old oak. It's the distance between this mud track and that distant cloud of rooftops. It's the feeling of watching the traveller drink from the well you share and move on, knowing that the water and the road in front of the house are the only things you have in common with him. You're not unhappy. That's the complicated thing. This is your life. The strips and the smoke and the people you've known every day of your 17 years, your mother's bread, your father's knowledge of the plough, handed to you, gesture by gesture. The particular shape of the late light in October across the fallow field. You're not unhappy. But you're beginning to understand the difference between not unhappy and free. They are genuinely not the same thing. The realization is quiet and immovable and sits with you in the evenings now. Some evenings in summer, when the work is done and the light is still in the sky, the village looks almost perfect. The angle of the late sun on the daub of the walls turning everything gold. The smell of the evening fires starting. Agnes at her door braiding something. Roger Hayward's pigs rooting in their pen. The children, not just yours, but all of them, the village's children, running in the space between the houses with the pure mechanical joy of small bodies that have been still all day. Your sister is in that number. She's 12, and she runs like something that doesn't know it will ever stop. And watching her, you feel something you can't quite name. Pride, maybe. Something about the word future. Your mother calls from the house. You go in. The fire is good. Your father is there, already seated, his hands resting on his knees in the posture of a man whose hands have earned their rest. Tired in the specific way of someone who's been tired for 30 years and made peace with it. You sit. Your mother passes the bowl. The pottage tonight has dried herbs in it. She saves them from the garden, dries them, uses them through winter and spring when fresh things are gone. Mint and something sharper that she calls by a name she learned from her own mother. Your sister comes in still slightly out of breath, her cheeks red, and eats with the appetite of someone who's been running. Outside, a late bird is calling, something in the elm. The fire crackles, the pottage is good, you are warm, you are fed, you are here. Late May. A Tuesday evening on the bench out front, the sunset still dragging. You're thinking about it properly. The way Hugh said to, "You cannot go to Oxford the way Robert did. You've seen what that costs. Not the legal cost. The other cost. The being brought back cost. The march through the village mud with 2 men on horses. The hall." Geoffrey's voice reading the charge. The note in the margin afterward. The 6 months of daily checking at the gate. The look in Robert's eyes. But you've been learning to read for 4 months now. Father William thinks you could eventually qualify for further instruction. The kind that leads eventually to novice status at a priory. The kind that leads by legal increment to ordination. Ordination makes you free. It also makes you a priest, which means a life you haven't chosen and can't entirely imagine, with its own specific constraints, but different constraints. And in the meantime, in the years between now and then, you can read. You can learn more. You have time. 17, almost 18. You have time. The road to that outcome is long and slow and safe in ways the Oxford road is not. You think about your father, who stopped looking at the doors, who is a good man, who built something real within the walls of an impossible situation. 7 strips held, a family fed, a daughter who runs in the evenings like she doesn't know the world will slow her down. You think about the road from the church tower. Both things can be true. You can love this place and want to leave it. You can respect your father's choices and be making different ones. You can be patient and still be moving, slowly, by Latin and candlelight, by priest's Latin and court roll Latin, and the specific letters that contain the specific words that describe the shape of the cage, until you know it better than the people who maintain it, until you can see the seams in the structure, and then, not this year, but the summer night comes in slowly at this latitude, the light bleeding out of the sky long after the sun has gone. You sit on the bench until the mosquitoes from the mill pond find you, then go in. Your father is already asleep. Your mother banks the fire, your sister curled into her familiar ball. You lie down. The sounds of Wolfham at night, the mill wheel still turning, the water sound carrying on still air, a dog somewhere, the particular silence that follows the dog, the familiar rhythm of the night that has played out in this village every night for 100 years, that will play out for 100 more. You fold your hands on your chest. You think about the letters, A, B, C, the sounds they make, the way they assemble into words, the way words assemble into sentences, the way sentences assemble into the precise legal Latin of a document that describes, in careful administrative terms, exactly what you are and what you owe and what you cannot do. Et est nativis maneri. You know what that means now. Tomorrow there will be the Northfield strip and the muck spreading and your father's peg dispute, and Geoffrey's morning round and the bread and the pottage and the sound of Hilda beyond the partition. The same as yesterday, the same as all the days, but also Tuesday evening and Father William and the board and the candle and the next lesson. The same days, moving. Centuries will pass. The England you know will change past recognition. The strips in the Northfield will eventually be enclosed, absorbed into larger farms, the medieval pattern erased by the straight lines of a later economy. The mill will be rebuilt and eventually fall silent. The manor house will be enlarged, reduced, used for purposes its builders couldn't have imagined. But the church will stand. The stones your grandfather might have watched being laid will stand through Reformation and plague and civil war, and the coming of machines and the going of empires. People will be baptized and married and buried under that roof for 700 years and counting, and the road will stand. The Oxford Road, running from Wolfham's south end along the ridge, still following the Roman line, because the Romans understood that the land lies the way it lies, and the best route over it doesn't change. It's paved now in the centuries to come, smooth and permanent, vehicles moving along it at speeds that would seem like sorcery from where you lie. But it goes to the same place, the same Oxford, the same spires, the same city that was 8 miles from Wolfham in 1286 and is 8 miles from Wolfham now. The distance doesn't change. What changes is the question of who can walk it. The villeinage system that holds you ended eventually, not with a revolution, though there almost was one 2 generations from now, when the labourers of England rose up in the summer of 1381 and marched on London, and came closer than anyone admits to changing everything. The system ended the way most systems end, slowly, by increments, by the pressure of circumstances. The Black Death came in 50 years and killed 1/3 of England, and suddenly lords needed labourers badly enough to pay for them, and the balance of power shifted in ways the law couldn't quite hold back. By 1500, the formal legal category of serfdom in England had essentially ceased to exist. 200 years. For the boy on the straw mattress in Wolfham in 1286, that's not particularly comforting. But the road is always there. The road and the letters and the slow, patient work of knowing the shape of the thing that holds you, until you know it better than it knows itself. People will still wake in the dark and lie still, listening to the night, thinking about the distance between here and somewhere else. People will still have plans they can't yet name, small and specific and patient, growing in the space between what is and what might be. People will still lie on their beds at the end of long physical days, their arms aching with honest work, the smell of the house around them, the warmth of the bodies sleeping nearby, and think. The human heart makes plans in the dark. That doesn't change. Robert's forge, before everything. You need to understand what Robert was walking away from, because it changes the shape of what he did. A man who runs from nothing is one kind of man. A man who runs from something real is another. The forge sat at the western end of the village, past the mill, where the track widened slightly before it met the Oxford Road. Robert's father, Will the smith, had worked it for 30 years. The building was black with permanent smoke, its thatch replaced 4 times in living memory, the stone floor worn into a slight bowl from decades of standing work. Inside, the smell was nothing like anything else in Wolfham. Metal and fire and the particular sharpness of hot iron that you could taste at the back of your throat. Char and oil and the animal smell of the leather bellows. In winter, the forge was the warmest building in the village by such a margin that the village boys found reasons to be near it, and Will let them stand as long as they stayed back from the fire. Robert grew up inside that warmth and smell. He grew up with arms that developed differently from yours. You ploughed and spread muck and hauled barrows, and your back took the weight of that work. Robert swung hammers from the time he was strong enough to hold one. His forearms were a different thing entirely by the time he was 15. The thickness of the wrist, the way the muscles ran. And he was his father's son in the technical sense too. He knew iron, knew how it behaved at different heats, The colour changes that told you when it was ready, the angle and weight of the stroke that shaped it most efficiently. He could sharpen a plough blade in 20 minutes to a standard that lasted twice as long as anyone else's work. The irony of a man with that skill being legally bound to a place it couldn't fully be used. Because Will Smith, despite being villain-born, worked a trade, he charged for it. He had income, modest, irregular, but real. The Lord took a portion of it. The custom of the manor included a smith's fee, a percentage of earnings from metalwork beyond the domain. Will had paid it his whole working life without drama. It was the shape of things. But Robert saw that the same hands that sharpened ploughs for Wolfham's 14 families could sharpen ploughs for 40 families in a larger settlement, could work copper and bronze if there was work to find, could earn wages in a place that paid wages. You went to the forge one evening in late September, a few weeks before he left, just to visit supposedly, borrowing a tool. But you stayed because the warmth was real and the conversation was easy, and Robert was in the middle of something. He was making a set of door hinges for Geoffrey's house. The irony of that was not lost on either of you. The Reeve paying the smith's son for ironwork while the smith's son planned his escape. Robert worked with the focus of someone who wasn't going to half do anything just because he was leaving. The iron went from the fire with tongs, its end glowing orange-white, and onto the anvil, and the hammer came down. The sound of iron being worked is extraordinary close up. Not the thin ring of a small bell, a deep, specific percussion that you feel in the chest as much as here. The way a struck drum feels physical. Robert's hammer fell and the iron moved and the note changed with the movement of the metal, a sound record of the work happening. He held it up, examined it, back into the fire. "You know what a hinge is worth in Oxford?" he said, without looking at her. "No." "About twice what Geoffrey's paying me." He worked the bellows. The fire brightened. Same iron, same skill, same work, different place. Different market. Different everything. He pulled the iron out. Back to the anvil. In Oxford there are 40 smiths, maybe more. But there are also 40 times more things that need a smith. The scale of it. The amount of work. The hammer fell. "My grandfather was free," he said between strokes. "My mother's side. Free tenant. Her father came to Wolfham when the old domain needed extra labour and took a villain's holding, and that made his children villains even though he'd been free. The holding transferred the status." He looked at the iron, rotating it slightly. "You know that? Doesn't matter who your parents were. Doesn't matter if your mother was born free. If the holding is villain tenure, the children are villains." "I know. My mother knows her father's name. The village he came from. Free tenant his whole life, until he came here for the land and made a mistake that his grandchildren are still paying for." He held the hinge up. "Cooling. Good work. The bend was clean. The metal consistent in thickness. I'm not paying for it my whole life," he said. "I'm done with it." He said it the way you state a fact about the harvest, the weather, the shape of the land. You went home that night through the cooling air and thought about the weight of the hammer and the sound it made, and the fact that some men know exactly what they're leaving and go anyway. The Lord's hunt came through in October. You were in the East Field when you heard it first. Sound carries over open ground in autumn. The leaves mostly down, the air cold enough to hold sound longer than summer. And the horn reached the village before the riders did. A hunting party. The Lord's party. Sir Robert de Vere hadn't been in residence. His steward had mentioned a hunt for late October. using the wooded ground north of the village that technically was the Lord's forest. Technically, everything was the Lord's forest if you went far enough back through the documents. You straightened in the field, stretched the back, watched. They came across the ridge from the north at a pace that looked effortless from a distance and must have been brutal up close. 6 horses moving hard, the riders in that particular settled posture of people who've spent their lives on horseback. Dogs moving with the horses, the pack's noise distinct even at this distance. A caught deer on a pack animal at the rear, its legs swinging. They passed within 200 yards of where you were standing. Sir Robert de Vere. You recognised him from the April visit. The tall man, the lordly posture. His clothing at this distance was a collection of colours you rarely saw together. Dark red, good green, the leather of his riding gear supple and fitted. The horse was grey with a dark mane and moved like something that knew its quality. He didn't look at the fields, not in a dismissive way, not deliberately. He simply looked where riders on a hunt look, forward, at the dogs, at the ground ahead, at wherever they're going next. The fields were peripheral, background, the landscape, which they were to him. This was scenery. The strips you'd spent the season working with the visual texture of his estate. The people visible in them were no more individually distinct than the trees on the ridge. You watched the party cross and disappear down the track toward the mill. The sounds faded. You went back to work. The afternoon light was good. Another hour before it dropped too low to see what you were doing. You bent and picked up the hoe and went back along the strip. Something had shifted slightly watching that. Not anger exactly, not resentment, which you were too tired for by October and had learned to process in the passive way of people, for whom resentment is a background condition rather than an acute one, more like a clarification. The way a lens can sometimes align and sharpen an image that was slightly blurred. That man on the grey horse had never hoed a strip in his life, had never spread muck or pulled root vegetables in the cold mud, or stood in line at the mill for an hour while the toll was calculated. He had never been checked against Geoffrey's tally. He had never sat in the cold hall for a Hallmote judgment. He also had never worried about whether the winter would kill anyone in his household. He had never calculated his food stores in November and understood that the calculation did not come out right. He had never watched the Reeve walk out of a neighbour's house with the family's ox. The freedom and the security went together. That was the thing. You'd been thinking about freedom as a direction, the road southwest, Oxford, the year and a day. But watching Sir Robert de Vere not look at the fields, you understood it differently. The freedom wasn't just a direction, it was a whole different set of concerns, different things keeping you up at night, different calculations. Whether that was better was a question you couldn't quite answer from here, but it was different. You thought about it through the rest of the afternoon. Your hoe worked the cold soil. Your hands moved automatically. Different is not nothing. Winter came in hard in December. The first snow fell on a Tuesday, which was a work day, and the question of whether snow cancelled labour obligations was answered the way such questions were always answered in Wolfham. No, unless the snow made the work physically impossible, which it had to reach a specific standard to qualify as. 2 inches, not impossible, work day. 6 inches. The question was handled case by Geoffrey. A foot. The domain fields were inaccessible and the day was technically suspended, but you were expected to spend it on indoor work, mending tools, repairing thatch, doing anything that could be documented when Geoffrey came to check. This December's first snow was 4 inches. You went to the domain gate. Geoffrey noted the tally. The work was repairing the stone wall on the domain's south side, which needed relaying every year or two where frost heaved it. Cold work. Your breath steamed continuously. Your fingers inside their rag wraps went first to numbness, and then to a deep, dull ache that wasn't exactly pain but was the precursor to it. You learned early in your first winter to work your fingers periodically, pressing them into your palm, releasing, pressing again, to keep the blood moving. Otherwise they stop responding properly. A cold hand that can't feel what it's holding is a danger. A stone dropped on a foot, a blade slipping. Your father showed you this. Showed you also which boots to save for the coldest days and which ones could be sacrificed to mud. Showed you how to stuff boots with hay for warmth. The dry hay changing the temperature inside entirely, the difference between hay-insulated and empty boot feet, a genuine matter of survival on the coldest days. Small knowledge, accumulated knowledge. The kind that doesn't come from anywhere except having been here before. You packed your boots with hay. The wall work was cold and slow and strangely meditative. Lifting stones from the tumbled section, checking their fit, rebuilding the line. Stone on stone, the wall growing back along the boundary. Cold from the stones working through your gloves, even through the rag wraps underneath. Thomas Carpenter worked beside you. He had a way of working in cold weather that seemed to involve minimizing the distance between his body and any source of warmth. And since there was no source of warmth, he folded, in slightly on himself, a subtle, protective configuration. He was excellent at walling despite this. His eye for stone fit was better than yours. He said, "You're still going to those lessons. Tuesday evenings. Read anything yet?" "A bit." He set a stone, considered it, set another. "What does it feel like?" he asked, not mockingly. Thomas asked questions the way he worked stone, careful, genuinely interested in the answer. You thought about it, about how to describe it to someone who'd never done it. The way the marks on the board resolved into sounds and sounds into words and words into meaning. The way meaning arrived in your head already there, fully formed, from marks on a surface someone else had made. Like someone talking to you from far away, you said. Like someone who died before you were born can still tell you something. Thomas considered this, set another stone. "Useful?" he asked. "I think so." "Geoffrey can't read," Thomas said. "He has the priest read the court rolls to him. The Lord Steward reads the accounts aloud at the Hallmote." "I know." Thomas looked at you. "That's interesting," he said, not elaborating, just noting it. The way you note a loose stone in a wall, something to think about. You set a stone on yours. The wall grew. January's particular violence. January in a medieval English village is not poetic. The word cold inadequately describes what happens in a longhouse in January when the fire must be rationed against the dwindling wood pile. You burn less in January because the wood you cut in autumn must last until March, and if you burn too much too fast, you're burning nothing in February, and February kills people. This is not a figure of speech. February kills people in Wolfham. Not often, not every year, but enough that January is spent doing the mathematics of February and finding them uncomfortable. The cold in the house at night reached into objects. Your boots left near the door might have a skin of ice in the morning from condensed moisture. The wooden spoon left out of the pottage pot would be faintly cold to the touch in a way that transferred to your grip with each stir. Hilda's warmth through the partition was not optional. You understood this fully in January. The ox's body heat conducting through wattle and daub was a measurable contribution to the livability of the human side. You were quite literally kept warm by an animal, and the word grateful doesn't quite capture it. It was more basic than gratitude. It was a practical dependency, warm-blooded and mutual in the direction of heat, food in January. By January the fresh things were long gone. The garden's yield had been eaten or stored. What remained was the stored food, grain, increasingly toward the bottom of the storage bags, the quality varying, the occasional mould issue requiring careful picking, dried beans and peas, root vegetables in the earth cellar behind the house, the salt pork in its barrel. Your mother's careful rationing. The pottage in January was thicker than summer pottage, less fresh, more substantive in the way that had nothing to do with flavour and everything to do with maintaining body heat. You ate it with the focused attention of someone who's long since stopped eating for pleasure and is eating for function. The taste was barley, the particular dense sweetness of it cooked long, bean flour thickening the broth, the salt pork, small pieces, fat and lean both, the salt having worked through the meat over months of storage, releasing its particular preserved smell into the room with each stir. Your mother's dried herbs. You ate every bit. Your sister got slightly more than her fair share when she was sick in the second week of January. A cough, not the dangerous kind, but a cough, and nobody mentioned it. Your father gave up the last of his portion twice. Your mother, who served last, always served herself from what remained, and what remained was always the least. These are the calculations that happen without words, in a household that knows exactly where the line is. The cold got into the reading lessons too. January evenings, the church so cold you could see your breath. Father William's candle the single source of warmth for two people in a stone room that retained every degree of cold the day accumulated. You brought a spare candle when you had one. Your hands ached from the day's work and then ached differently from gripping the stylus. Father William had given you a wax tablet to practice on, flat board coated with beeswax, marks made with a pointed stick, smoothed over when you needed to start again, reusable, sensible. You wrote your name, Thomas Filius Wilhelmi, Thomas son of William, and then the other words you'd learned, manerium, manor, nativus, serf, fuga, flight, libertus, freed. Father William watched you. You know these words. I looked in the court roll, you said. The one you keep in the vestry. A pause. He chose his next words carefully. Father William was a gentleman who'd spent 20 years ministering to a village full of people whose concerns were concrete and immediate and rarely theological. He'd made his accommodations with the world as it was. Those documents are the Lord's property, he said. They're kept in God's house, you said. Silence. They describe people in this village, you said. He looked at the wax tablet. Your writing. The names of the things that held you, written in your own hand. Continue, he said finally. The next lesson is the verbs. Spring. The world cracked open in early March in a way that was, after the specific grey violence of January and February, almost offensive in its abruptness. 1 week cold rain. The fields locked and lifeless. Next week, green, not gradually. The green came fast in the first warm days, a visible change that happened almost while you watched. The earth producing it, drawing warmth down from the thin sun, converting it. You were in the east field for the spring, ploughing in mid-March. Hildy and your father's second ox, borrowed from Matthew's family, who'd borrowed her last fall in turn, walking the strip in a straight line while your father guided the plough. Spring ploughing is different from autumn ploughing. The ground is softer in a different way, wet soft rather than cold hard, the soil giving under the blade without resistance, the smell of it when turned immense. That is not a small observation. The smell of freshly turned earth in March is one of the particular pleasures of the world, available to anyone who spent a winter with their nose full of smoke and salt meat, and the Longhouse's combined humanity. The earth smell in March is, green is not exactly the right word, dark, mineral, alive. Your job was to break the clods the plough turned up, mallet and hand, walking the ploughed furrow, breaking any compacted lumps into finer tilth. Tedious work, work that required no thought and thus set your mind completely free. You thought about what you'd read over the winter. Father William had found you a copy of a letter, not a fancy manuscript, a working document, a copy of a petition someone had written years back regarding a neighbouring manor's customary labour rates, the kind of document that circulated between church institutions and occasionally made its way to small parish libraries. The Latin was functional, not elegant, but it had described the conditions of villein labour in 3 manors, and it had used the specific legal terminology you'd been learning, and reading it, slowly, word by word, Father William's finger moving along the line, had been like seeing your own situation described from the outside, like reading about yourself written in someone else's handwriting. The gap between the life and the document describing it was something you were still adjusting to. You'd lived 17 years in Wolfham, understanding it from inside, from the specific daily texture of it. Now you could read it from outside, from the position of the clerk who wrote the document, the lawyer who would argue about it, the lord who signed his name to the rolls. That perspective was not nothing. The mallet came down on a clod. It broke. Another one. Broke. Your father's voice ahead, guiding the oxen, the creak of the wooden plough, Hilda's steady rhythm, the Eastfield smelling of itself. Let me tell you about the Hallmote in April, because this is where it becomes real in a different way. The Manor Court met 4 times a year, formally. The April Hallmote handled the spring planting disputes, the winter's accumulated grievances, any unpaid fines from the preceding months. It was the closest thing to governance Wolfham had. Everyone who held tenure attended. Required, not optional. Geoffrey called it, and men appeared, because the fine for absence without cause was recorded in the roll, and the roll followed you. The hall was the manor house's main room, unoccupied most of the year, used for these occasions, smelling of old rushes and the particular closed-in staleness of a space not frequently aired. Long benches, a table at one end where Geoffrey sat with the court roll, the inkhorn, the pen. A bailiff standing at one side with his stick, not for violence but for the visual impression of authority. April's court had 7 cases. The first was straightforward. Adam the shepherd had allowed his flock to graze onto a strip held by Richard Hayward during the post-harvest period, and Richard claimed the damage to his stubble reduced the spring's workability. The custom was clear. Commoner grazing rights on post-harvest strips, but the boundary conditions were debated. Geoffrey heard both men's accounts, conferred with 2 jurors, noted a judgment that Adam owed Richard a measure of seed grain in April as compensation. Adam accepted this without visible emotion. Noted. The second case was the boundary dispute. Your father's dispute with Matthew over the 3-foot strip between their Northfield holdings. You sat and watched your father stand in the open space and state his case. William had the calm of a man who'd been through enough Hallmotes to know how to behave in one. He stated the claim clearly, the history of the markers, his own memory of where the boundary had been during his father's holding, Matthew countered. Matthew had been at the boundary himself since his father died, and had his own clear memory. Geoffrey heard both, looked at the jury, called 2 older men as witnesses, both past 60, both with memory of the field in question, reaching back further than either Matthew or William. The older men conferred. They had between them a rough consensus on where the boundary had stood for the longest. It wasn't exactly where your father's markers were. It wasn't exactly where Matthew's were either. Geoffrey split the difference, noted it in the roll. The boundary was drawn where the witness's memory placed it, which was approximately 2 feet into what your father considered his, and approximately 1 foot into what Matthew claimed. Your father returned to his bench without expression. You thought about reading the roll afterward, about whether you could now read the entry that would describe this judgment. You could, probably, most of it. The Latin was standard, Wilhelmus filius Henrici et Matthias filius Edmundi, in placito de bundis, in a dispute about boundaries. You knew those words. The 6th case was something you hadn't expected. A man named John, cottager from the edge of the village, was brought before the court accused of selling labour to a free tenant in the next village without Geoffrey's permission and without paying the lord the relevant fee. The labour had been worth 2 shillings. The fee owed was 4p. John had not paid it. John stood in the open space and his hands were flat against his thighs, in the way that told you he was controlling himself carefully. Geoffrey stated the charge. The evidence was documented, a note from the free tenant acknowledging the work, obtained through the steward's network. The jury found for the Lord's custom, the fine 6p, more than the original fee would have been. John accepted it. You watched him walk back to his bench. He was perhaps 45, a compact man with the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by things some years back. 6p for working 2 days for wages. You thought about this on the walk home, the specific geometry of it, the fine for attempting to earn money being larger than the fee that would have made the earning legitimate, the system saying, in careful economic terms, we don't mind you working outside the manor, but we will set the cost of doing so without our knowledge high enough to discourage it. Discouraging independence as a policy, documented in the roll, which you could now read. The summer brought a visitor. This doesn't happen often. Wolfham is not on a route that brings interesting traffic. The Oxford Road runs near it, but doesn't run through it. You turn off the road to reach the village, down a lane that branches, and nobody turns down that lane unless they're coming here specifically. In late June, a travelling friar came, Franciscan, grey habit, bare feet despite the road's condition, which you regarded with a mixture of admiration and practical scepticism. He arrived with a small pack and nothing else, and asked at the church whether the parish would have him for an evening, as he'd been walking from Abingdon, and the next village was 3 miles and the light was going. Father William housed him. Word spread, as word does in Wolfham, without any formal mechanism, simply by the village being a small place where everyone's business is visible. And by evening a small gathering had formed near the church. Not formal, just people who wanted to hear something from outside. The friar was perhaps 50, weathered the way foot travellers weather, with a quality of stillness that didn't look like peace so much as like someone who'd been in enough difficult situations to stop being startled by new ones. He talked about what he'd seen, the towns he'd passed through, a fire in Reading 3 weeks past, a dispute between two monasteries over a piece of land that had apparently been ongoing for 60 years and seemed unlikely to resolve. He mentioned Oxford. You were at the back of the small gathering, standing. You listened with a specific attention. Oxford, the friar said, was busy, always busy. The university had hundreds of scholars now, students from across England and France, and as far as Italy, living in the halls and the boarding houses, arguing philosophy in the streets, buying food from every vendor in the market quarter. He'd stayed at the Franciscan house near the castle gate for 2 nights and been kept awake by the noise of debate from the halls next door. Debate about what? Someone asked. Everything, the friar said, with the slight smile of someone who found this genuinely funny. They debate whether God can make a thing that even he cannot unmake. They debate whether angels occupy physical space. They debate the relative status of natural law and divine law. They debate in Latin, which means it goes late into the night and disturbs people who are trying to sleep. Small laughter. The city itself, he said, has perhaps 8,000 or 9,000 people. The market runs 3 days a week. The castle is still garrisoned. There are perhaps a dozen major churches and the Franciscan house and a Dominican house and the priory. He described it as casually as a man describing somewhere he'd been last week. 8,000 or 9,000 people. Wolfham had 240. You tried to hold that number. 8,000 people in one place, going about 8,000 sets of daily concerns, the collective noise of it, the smell of it, the market 3 times a week, the university halls, the castle. The friar was asked about the road south. He was heading toward Winchester, and the conversation moved on. You stood at the back and did not move for a while after it ended. It's July, 18 months since Robert was brought back from Oxford. Robert Smith now works the forge in the mornings and does his 4-day week work and presents himself at the manor gate every day as required, and Geoffrey checks the tally, and this will continue until the spring. The additional months of supervision were added after a second incident, minor, that you don't need to detail. It's enough to say that Robert has not stopped thinking about it either. The forge work is good. The look in his eyes is not exactly defeated. It's something more like patient, which is either hopeful or heartbreaking, depending on what you mean by patience. You haven't spoken directly about it. You've been at the Tuesday lessons for 6 months. Your Latin is at the point where Father William uses a different word to describe you, not beginner. He hasn't said the new word aloud, but you can see the assessment in the way he paces the lessons, the material he offers. He found you another document, this one a copy of a land grant from the nearby priory, granting certain rights to a free tenant, standard church legal Latin, complex sentences. You worked through it over 3 sessions and got most of it. He said, there's a priory at St. Fridswide's in Oxford that takes novices for the lay brotherhood, not for orders if you don't want orders, just for the work of the house. Transcription, records, there's demand for people who can read and write documents well. He said this without looking at you. He was arranging the board. They'd take someone my age, you said? If there was a recommendation. Silence. The candle between you. Would there be a recommendation, you said? He aligned the board carefully on the table. I believe there might be, he said. You kept your face still. The ways. You've learned to keep your face still in situations where showing what you feel would be giving too much away in a place where everything you give away gets used. I'd need to speak to my father, you said. Yes, he said. You would. Your father. You've been circling this for months. Since January, really. Since the night you lay in the dark after Robert came back and understood that the road Robert took was probably not your road, but that there might be another one, slower and less dramatic and more likely to arrive somewhere. You've been circling it the way you circle a difficult piece of wall, looking at it from different angles, finding the right approach. The thing about your father is that he's not a fool. You've been thinking of him as someone who gave up, and that's not exactly right. He made a choice, the choice to invest himself completely in the life that was available, rather than the one that wasn't. He knows how much the strips yield under different conditions. He knows which neighbours can be trusted and which ones you watch carefully. He knows the land so deeply that standing in the field he can tell you what happened in a specific strip 10 years ago by looking at the colour of the growth. He's not someone who failed to escape. He's someone who decided at a certain point to be where he was. The question was whether he'd see the difference between himself and you. Whether he could hold both things at once, pride in his own choice and willingness for yours to be different. You chose a Sunday evening, after supper, the light still in the sky, your mother and sister in the garden, your father sitting by the fire, in the particular posture of a man who stopped moving for the day and feels the day in his body. Father, you said. He looked at you. I want to talk to you about something. Then talk. So you did. You explained what Father William had said. The priory, the lay brotherhood, the work of transcription and records. You explained it in full, including the part about how a man who went to work for a church institution in a legitimate capacity, with the church's formal request and the Lord's permission, because you'd need the Lord's permission, and the church's request would make that permission politically difficult for Sir Robert de Vere to refuse without creating a dispute with the Church of Rome, which even minor lords preferred to avoid, was in a different legal position than a man who ran down the Oxford Road without telling anyone. Different, slower, documentable. Your father was quiet for a long time. The fire breathed. You've been planning this, he said. I've been thinking about it. Since when? You thought about honesty. Since Robert. Before Robert, a little. He nodded, not in agreement with anything, just acknowledging the information. The Lord's permission, he said. Geoffrey would have to present it at the next Hallmote. Sir Robert would need to sign off. The priory's request would be formal in writing. The church has standing. You've been learning to read, he said, since January. He looked at you. The firelight moved. Father William's evenings, you said. Tuesday. A pause that lasted long enough that you counted your own heartbeats. The fire. The sound of your mother's voice in the garden saying something to your sister. Your mother should know, he said. Yes. And the strips. His hands were on his knees. Matthew can help. His family owes us. And there's the arrangement with the Carpenter brothers about the autumn work. You realised he was thinking out loud, running the problem, seeing whether it worked. I'd be another set of hands until spring, you said. There's still the summer work. Spring, he said. After the spring planting. He looked at the fire. I'll talk to Geoffrey, he said. Not asking, just talking, seeing how the land lies. You kept your voice even. I know what you think. He said it without sharpness, tiredly, like a man who's been carrying something heavy for a while and is setting it down carefully, checking whether it was as heavy as he thought. You're going to go, Thomas. I've known it since you were small. You looked at things the way... He stopped. Your grandfather looked at things that way, he said. My father. He died here, same as his father, but he looked at things that way, like the looking itself was a form of planning. Silence. You're not your grandfather, he said. That's not a complaint. He put his hands flat on his knees and pushed himself up. The movement of a man in his 40s getting to his feet at the end of a long day, the brief negotiation with the back, the deliberate shift of weight. Talk to your mother, he said. She should hear it from you, not me. He went out to the garden. You sat by the fire alone for a moment. Outside, you could hear his voice mixing with your mother's, quiet and ordinary. The thing about leaving a place is that the leaving is partly theoretical until it isn't. All through August, you worked the harvest. Your own harvest, your family's harvest. The actual grain going into the barn, the smell of it, the weight of the sheaves, the physical satisfaction of seeing the strip emptied and the store increasing. You worked it with the particular attention of someone doing something for what might be one of the last times, not the final time. You'd be here through the autumn, through the winter, into the spring planting. But the last harvest where the full future was still ahead, unbroken, you thought about what a harvest meant. 500 years of this, on this land or land very like it. Your family's line working these fields back to before anyone living could remember. Your grandfather, who looked at things the way you looked at things and never went anywhere. And you thought, the going doesn't erase all of this. The going is made of all of this. You know how barley grows and how it's cut and how it's stored and how to calculate what a family needs for winter. Because this place taught you that. You know how to move in a crowd and wait in a line and when to push and when to hold still. Because this village has 17 years of instruction in you. You can't ungrow from a place. You can outgrow it. There's a difference. The letter from St. Fritzwide's Priory arrived at the church in September. Father William brought it to you on a Tuesday evening, and you read it yourself, which was still novel enough to feel significant. The Latin was formal church document Latin, the hand neat and practised. The Priory was requesting a young man of demonstrated ability in reading and basic writing to assist in the scriptorium work, to live in the lay brothers' quarters, to be paid in board and a small stipend. Any candidate would require the permission of his manor lord, and the Priory was prepared to issue a formal letter of request to the relevant lord to facilitate this. It described a life, a small life, in certain ways, copying documents, learning the work of the scriptorium, living under the Priory's roof and schedule and expectations, not the merchant's life at the exchange, not the sailor's 30 years at sea, but a life in Oxford, a life that involved text and knowledge, and the specific freedom of someone who earns their keep through their mind rather than through the weight of their body. A life that was, legally, by measured and documented increments, not the life of a villain. You read it twice, then you set it carefully on the board. It's a good offer, Father William said. Yes. The Priory is well established. The work is honest. The brothers are. Some of them are difficult men. I won't pretend otherwise. But the institution is sound. Is it far from the city centre? A 15-minute walk, he said. To the market square, to the university halls. 15 minutes from the quiet of a scriptorium. 15 minutes to 8,000 people. Geoffrey's reaction. You went to Geoffrey yourself. Your father had spoken to him once the way he said he would, just talking, laying the ground. And now you came directly, which was the right protocol. Geoffrey was in his house on a Thursday afternoon going over accounts. His wife, a woman of few visible opinions who managed their household with the efficiency of someone who'd made their peace with a complicated arrangement, brought you ale without being asked and left. You sat across from Geoffrey and told him what you wanted. Formally, the Priory's request, the Lord's permission required, the formal route. Geoffrey listened. He had his face for this. The Reeve's listening face, the one that processed information before giving anything back. The letter from the Priory is real, you said. Father William has it. It's dated, witnessed. I'll need to see it. I'll bring it. He was quiet. Your father's agreed, he said. Not a question. Yes. The strips. Matthew Edmondson's family will manage the spring work in exchange for the autumn help we've given them. There's a standing arrangement. My father discussed it with Richard Hayward. You could see Geoffrey noting this, running the calculation. A manor losing a working villein was a minor matter in aggregate. 240 people, one less. But custom required a formal process, and the formal process was his to manage. The Lord would need to formally release you from villein tenure, Geoffrey said. Alternatively, the Priory's request would need to be phrased in a way that creates an ongoing obligation. You remain technically bound to the manor, but are permitted to fulfill the Church's requirement. That's a different legal status. Which is more likely to be approved? He looked at you. The second. Sir Robert is more likely to sign a document that says he's generously permitting a villein to serve the Church than one that says he's releasing a working man from his estate. Fine, you said. Geoffrey's expression shifted by an amount that would be invisible to someone who hadn't been watching him for 18 years. A fractional change. Something that might have been respect, or might just have been the Reeve's recognition of a competent transaction. You've thought about this carefully, he said. Yes, he picked up his pen. I'll draft a request to the Lord Steward in Wallingford. The Priory letter will need to accompany it. Give it a month. A month? At least. He dipped the pen. That's how long things take. You stood. He was already writing. Thomas, he said, without looking up. You stopped. Your father is a good man, he said. The village will manage without you. It was the closest thing to a farewell Geoffrey was capable of. Delivered over a document without eye contact. You understood it for what it was. Thank you, you said. You walked home through the September evening, the air carrying the smell of cut grain and old summer. The month was actually 6 weeks. The Lord Steward processed the request. The formal permission arrived. Sir Robert de Vere, Lord of Wolfham Manor, graciously permitted Thomas, son of William, villein of the said manor, to take up a position of service to St. Fridsweed's Priory in Oxford, the said Thomas remaining technically bound to the manor by ancient tenure, but being permitted to fulfil his church obligation for a period of not less than 1 year, renewable at the Lord's discretion. Not freedom, an exception, but an exception documented in writing. Hugh, when you brought the document to show him, read it the way he tested rope, carefully, feeling for weaknesses. He found none. He handed it back. Good, he said. It's not manumission. No, it's better in some ways. It's deniable. Nobody has to admit they let a villein go free. The Lord's dignity is intact. He looked at you with the working eye. And you're in Oxford, with the Church's backing. For 1 year, renewable. And if you're useful to the Priory, they'll renew it. The Church doesn't give up useful people. He paused. Learn everything you can. Read everything they let you near. Make yourself too valuable to return. That's the plan. Good. He picked up his rope. You stood for a moment. The lane outside his cot. November coming in, the light going early. Hugh, he looked up. Thank you. He made the sound that in Hugh's economy was equivalent to a speech. You walked back down the lane. The last evening. You sat at the bench outside your house in the last of the November light. The village at its evening pace. Fires being built up. Doors closing against the cold. The first stars coming into a clear sky over the eastern field. Your mother had fed you supper. All of your favourite things, impractical in November, produced none the less by some alchemy of care and planning. The pottage with proper herbs, the bread fresh baked that day, even somehow a piece of dried apple from the last of the autumn store. Your father had gone to bed early, which was not his habit, which was a particular kind of statement. Your sister had hugged you without saying anything, which was a different kind of statement. You sat outside and watched the village go quiet. The mill turned, the water sound carrying. The elm by Hugh's cot, leafless now, its branches articulate against the sky. Agnes's house, where a candle was still going. The track of mud between the houses, frozen now, your boots sitting on it in the particular way. They'd sat on it 10,000 mornings. Tomorrow you'd walk the lane to the Oxford Road. You had a bag with your clothes and the spare boot wrapping and the wax tablet, and Father William's letter of introduction, and the formal permission document in its folded parchment. You'd walk to the landmark oak and past it and not stop. 8 miles was a morning's walk in good conditions. In November it was a morning and a portion of an afternoon. You'd arrive before dark. You thought about what Hugh said. Don't let the city grind that out of you. You thought about your father. I'm still here. Said without bitterness, or with bitterness that had been worked through so many times, it had become something else. Something like acceptance that didn't require forgetting. You thought about Robert, who'd been brought back down this same road in November 2 years ago. Robert who was still at the forge. Robert whose freedom had failed at 11 days. You thought about his face in the hall and the sound the hammer made on the anvil and his hands when he shook yours in the dark behind the church. You had something he didn't. Not superiority, not luck exactly, though luck was a component. You had a piece of paper and the Priory's name on it, and Geoffrey's signature and the Lord's seal. You had Father William's Tuesday evenings accumulated. You had Hugh's rope-testing precision. You had a road and a document, and the strange, inadequate, sufficient fact that you could read the words that described your situation and therefore held them differently than a man who couldn't. That's not nothing. Tomorrow. Tonight, though. Tonight you're still here. The stars are coming out one by one over the east field. The same field you've worked since you were old enough to carry something. The same strips. 7 of them. Your family's ground. Held by custom. Tilled by your grandfather's grandfather's grandfather. Not owned. Held. The ground remembers the work done to it, in a sense. The muck spread, the stones picked out year after year, the patient slow improvement of the soil over centuries of attention. Work that doesn't look like much from a distance. Dirt, and people moving through dirt. But the grain grows. The grain grows where it grew last year and the year before, from ground that someone tended, and the tending is accumulated and permanent even when the person who did it is long gone. You'll carry Wolfham into Oxford in the way that places work themselves into people. The specific morning smell of the domain gate when the frost was on it. The sound of Hilda through the partition. the weight of a mallet on a cold morning, the way the light moved across the south field at harvest. These things don't come out. You don't want them to. The village quiets around you. The last light is gone from the sky. The stars. Let your hands rest now. The hands that have worked the strips and the hedges and the Lord's wall and the cold repair of things that always need repairing. The hands that have been numb in January and bleeding in winter and stiff from the stylus on Tuesday evenings. Let them be still. The cold is coming up through the bench, through your coat, but it's a familiar cold. The cold that's been here your whole life and will be here long after. The church bell rings from the far end of the village. Father William's bell. The Vespers bell. The same bell you rang that Sunday afternoon when you climbed into the tower and saw the road. Let the sound go. Let the road go. Let tomorrow be tomorrow. The body knows what it needs. After the ploughing and the hedging and the carrying and the cold. After everything the day asked. After all the asking. It needs this, just this. Centuries will pass. The Wolfham you know will change and change again, and keep changing until it bears no resemblance to itself. The strips in the 3 fields will disappear when the enclosures come. The common field system, 10 centuries old, will be absorbed into private farms, and the peasants who farmed it will move to cities or become labourers on land that used to be theirs to hold by custom. The manor house will be rebuilt. The church will stand. Hilda's descendants will live different lives, in different conditions, in ways that would seem miraculous to her. The Oxford Road will become a motorway, and the 8 miles to Oxford will take 11 minutes by car, and the travellers on it won't notice the field at all. But people will still lie down at the end of long, physical days in November. Will still feel the ache of honest work in the specific places it lives, the lower back, the hands, the particular tired weight of the legs. Will still think, in the dark before sleep comes, about tomorrow, about plans, about the gap between the life they have and the life that might be possible. Will still do the quiet arithmetic of survival and find it manageable, just for now. Will still hear a bell somewhere in the distance and feel the night come in and decide for tonight that thinking is done. That's enough for tonight. You're warm enough, tired enough, ready enough. Let the thinking go soft. Let the sound of the mill carry you the way water carries things, gently, in no particular direction, out toward where the sound fades. Wolfham at night. The mud frozen, the elm bare against the stars. 8 miles away, Oxford is full of its 8,000 lives, going on without you, not yet knowing you're coming. Tomorrow. But first, this. Just the quiet, just the dark pressing softly against everything. Just the slow, inevitable, completely necessary loss of consciousness that comes to every person who has worked a full day and earned their rest. You've earned it. Take it. Let sleep come the way the seasons come, without announcement, without asking permission, simply arriving because the time for it has arrived. Good night.